"Where's your shadow, Ethan?" The question split Millbrook's town square in half on the hottest afternoon of July, when Ethan Marsh was 8 years old and standing in the middle of the Founders' Day picnic with nearly 300 people staring at the clean concrete beneath his sneakers. The bell at First Baptist Church had just struck noon. The sun hung high over southern Ohio, and every person in the square cast a short, sharp shadow angled north. Every person except Ethan. His mother, Karen Marsh, had been laughing at something Pastor Whitfield said, one hand resting lightly on her son's shoulder. Then her laughter stopped in the middle of a breath, as abruptly as a record needle dragged across vinyl. She looked down. She looked at the dark shapes gathered around her neighbor's shoes. Then she looked down again, and her fingers went cold against Ethan's collarbone. Peggy Simmons, a 6-year-old with red braids and the blunt honesty of a child, was the first to say it aloud. She tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointed, and announced that the new boy did not have a shadow. The Marsh family had moved back to Millbrook only 6 months earlier, returning to the town where Daniel's family had once owned a farm. Until that moment, Ethan had been nothing more than the quiet new kid who lived in the rented house beyond Elm Street. Then Peggy's words moved through the crowd faster than the summer heat, faster than the smell of grilled hot dogs and fresh-cut grass, until every face turned toward him. Ethan stood perfectly still. His 2 sneakers were planted on sun-baked concrete, but there was no smudge beside them, no silhouette, no dark proof that his body blocked the light at all. For one endless, ringing moment, nobody spoke. The only sounds were the low hum of cicadas and the distant slap of a screen door somewhere along Maple Street. Karen's grip tightened until it hurt. She began pulling Ethan away from the crowd, away from Pastor Whitfield's suddenly pale face, away from the whispers rising like steam from the pavement. Ethan did not understand what was happening. He understood only that his mother's hand was shaking and that people who had smiled at him during the pie contest were stepping back, leaving a circle of empty space around him as if whatever was wrong might spread. Someone near the lemonade table whispered the word cursed. It was probably not meant to reach him, but sound traveled easily through the still air, and the word lodged behind his ribs. His father, Daniel Marsh, came jogging across the square from the parking lot with his keys in one hand and his work shirt half untucked. By the time he reached his wife and son, he did not need to ask what was wrong. He could see his boy standing in hard noon light, while the ground around him remained blank. The family left without their casserole dish, and without saying goodbye to anyone. Daniel kept one hand firm against Ethan's back as he guided him toward their rusted Buick, while Karen looked over her shoulder, as if she expected the whole town to follow them down Elm Street. Nobody did. Somehow that was worse. The town did not need to follow. The story would travel on its own, from porch to porch and phone to phone, faster than the Marsh family could outrun it. That night, Ethan lay awake and listened to his parents argue in urgent whispers through the thin wall. He caught fragments about doctors, school, moving again, and what people were going to say. He climbed out of bed, switched on the lamp, and held his hand between the bulb and the wall. Light spread around his fingers, but no hand-shaped darkness appeared behind them. He tried again with his whole arm. Nothing. At last he stood with his back inches from the wall, and stared over his shoulder, hoping for even the faintest outline. The light seemed to wrap around him as if the world had decided he was not solid enough to stop it. He would spend the next 4 years avoiding daylight, living behind drawn curtains and learning to flinch at the sound of other children laughing outside. He would learn that some kinds of absence could not be hidden, no matter how small a person tried to make himself. None of it would prepare him for what was waiting beyond the edge of Millbrook, in a place the old maps did not bother to name. A particular kind of silence settles over a house when a family stops explaining itself to the outside world. Ethan grew up inside that silence. Karen kept the blinds closed during the brightest hours, not out of cruelty, but because fear had become part of the furniture, something everyone stepped around without naming. Daniel worked longer shifts at the hardware store than he needed to. Some nights, Ethan wondered whether his father preferred the fluorescent stockroom to the quiet waiting at home. School became a county home study program supervised by Karen. She had withdrawn Ethan 2 weeks after the picnic, after finding strips of masking tape arranged like a crooked little shadow beneath his classroom chair. No teacher admitted seeing who had done it. By the time Ethan was 12, he had grown taller and quieter. Indoors, he could almost pretend that the missing shadow did not matter. At night, when sleep would not come, his thoughts drifted back beyond the picnic and toward the night he was born. The memories were impossible. He knew that. A newborn could not remember rain striking hospital windows or lightning whitening a room. Still, the images lived in him with the stubborn shape of a dream repeated too many times. He remembered, or believed he remembered, rain hammering Millbrook General Hospital so hard that the glass sounded full of static. The local paper later called it the strangest storm in 40 years. It had formed over a clear September sky in 11 minutes, and vanished the moment Ethan took his first breath. He remembered, or had heard the story often enough to make it his own, a tall figure standing outside the third-floor maternity ward window. The figure had no umbrella and did not react to the lightning behind it. It watched Karen through rain-streaked glass for the length of one contraction. When the nurses looked, it was gone. In daylight, Karen called it exhaustion after 14 hours of labor. Yet Ethan had once found her at the kitchen window before dawn, staring into the yard with an expression that told him she had never stopped believing what she saw. 3 weeks before his 13th birthday, Ethan finally asked her whether anything else had been strange about the night he was born. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table with 2 untouched glasses of milk between them. Karen remained silent so long that Ethan thought she would refuse to answer. Then she told him the delivery nurse had counted his fingers and toes twice. Nothing was wrong with them. The nurse was delaying because, for nearly a minute beneath the bright delivery room lights, the newborn in Karen's arms had cast no shadow on the floor. Everyone present had seen it. Without discussing the decision, they had all agreed never to mention it outside the room. The truth landed on Ethan like a physical weight. His shadow had not vanished during a picnic. It had been absent from the first moment of his life, taken, withheld, or never given. That same week, a folded sheet of paper appeared beneath the mat on the front porch. Ethan found it before sunrise. His name was written across the front in uneven, old-fashioned handwriting, and the ink looked silver under the porch light. The message inside contained only 2 sentences. What was taken can be found. Agnes Hollow, at the old grain mill on Miller's Creek, will tell you where to begin, but you must come alone and come soon. Ethan stood on the porch in the gray light, the note trembling between his fingers. 12 years of silence seemed to crack open in front of him. Before either parent woke, he put on his jacket, left a note saying he had gone for a walk, and followed the county road toward Miller's Creek. The old grain mill stood nearly 3 miles outside town, leaning toward the water as if listening to it. Its wheel had not turned in decades, but smoke rose from a narrow stovepipe attached to the miller's cottage. Ethan knocked once. The door opened before his knuckles touched the wood a second time. Agnes Hollow was small, straight-backed, and older than anyone Ethan knew. Her white hair was tied at the nape of her neck, and her pale eyes went immediately to the empty ground beside his shoes. She did not ask his name. She said she had been expecting him since the church bell rang 4 summers earlier. Inside, the cottage smelled of cedar smoke, dust, and something bitter steeping in a black kettle. Maps covered one wall. Most showed Millbrook and the surrounding hills, but each map had a blank patch west of Miller's Creek, beyond an abandoned limestone quarry. Agnes admitted that she had sent the note. She said her father had been a boy when Walter Marsh came to the mill during the hardest winter Millbrook had ever known. Walter had arrived after midnight with ice in his beard and terror in his eyes. He asked for directions to a place his own father had warned him never to seek. By dawn, Walter returned with silver in his pockets and a shadow so thin that the mill lamps shone through its edges. Agnes called the being he met the Dusk Man. Some people called him Graves. He did not break into homes or drag victims into the woods. He waited until desperate people came to him, then offered relief in exchange for whatever they believed they could live without. The danger, Agnes said, was that people rarely understood the full shape of what they offered. A bargain made in fear could leave an echo. If the person who made it died in shame and silence, that echo could travel through a family until it found someone able to carry it. Ethan asked whether his missing shadow was that echo. Agnes answered with one word. Inherited. She took a hand-drawn map from a drawer and placed it on the table. A narrow route led from the quarry into a place labeled Hollow Vale. Beside the route was a symbol, a circle divided by one straight line. Agnes warned him that only the person carrying the inherited debt could pass safely through the opening. Anyone else who entered would be noticed as a new customer. She also warned him that Graves would try to turn the old debt into a new bargain. That was how inherited burdens survived. He would ask what Ethan was willing to give. He might offer to remove pain, shame, or memory. Ethan was not to name a price. He was to carry something that had belonged to Walter, state both their full names, remember the name of his home, and refuse to renew the trade. Agnes could not promise that Graves would release him. She could promise only that bargaining would make the debt truly his. Before Ethan left, she pressed the map into his hand and told him not to confuse fear with permission. Then she closed the door, leaving him on the porch with the sound of Miller's Creek moving behind him. Ethan returned home near sunset. Karen was rinsing dishes, and Daniel was unlacing his work boots by the back door. Instead of sitting at the table, Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway and asked whether there was something about the Marsh family they had never told him, something inherited that was connected to the night he was born. The plate in Karen's hands slipped before she caught it. Daniel's fingers froze on his bootlaces. For several seconds, nobody spoke, and the refrigerator seemed unbearably loud. Karen set the plate down and turned to face her son. Her expression held less surprise than relief, the look of someone who had carried a weight alone for years and had just been told she could finally set it down. She asked where he had heard the word inherited. When Ethan admitted that he had gone to Miller's Creek and spoken with Agnes Hollow, Daniel sat heavily at the table and rubbed both hands over his face. He said they had always known this day might come. They had only hoped it would not come while Ethan was still a child. What followed was a story either parent had planned to tell before his 18th birthday. Daniel's grandfather, Walter Marsh, had owned a farm outside Millbrook during the worst winter anyone in the family could remember. Crops had failed the previous summer. The bank was preparing to take the land, and Walter's children were going to bed hungry. One night, Walter walked along the frozen creek and disappeared until dawn. He returned with enough silver to save the farm and buy food, but from that winter onward, people said his shadow looked faded and stretched thin. Walter never explained what he had done. He died refusing to discuss it. The family came to believe that the debt had not been paid. It had only been postponed, passed forward like a sealed envelope until someone inherited both the rescue and its cost. Ethan asked why his parents had kept the story from him. Karen's eyes filled with tears. She said that before his birth, they had treated Walter's bargain as old family folklore. Even after the delivery room incident, they had tried to believe the lights and exhaustion had fooled everyone. For 8 years, Ethan seemed healthy, and they convinced themselves the story had ended. Then the Founders' Day sun exposed what they had been too frightened to test. Daniel admitted that he had spent the next 4 years writing to distant relatives, searching county archives, and driving to Miller's Creek. Twice he parked near the old mill. Twice he saw a light in Agnes Hollow's window and turned around without knocking. Ethan placed Agnes's map on the kitchen table. He told them about the Dusk Man, the Hollow Vale, and the rule that only the person carrying the debt could cross without creating another bargain. Karen immediately said no. Daniel offered to go in Ethan's place. Ethan let them speak until both ran out of words. Then he told them he had spent 4 years hiding behind curtains because of a choice made before he was born. He had waited for adults to explain it, fix it, or admit it. None of them had been able to. Whatever waited beyond the quarry, he intended to face it himself. He would not trade. He would not pass the debt forward. He would close the envelope. It took 2 weeks of arguments before Karen and Daniel accepted that stopping Ethan might drive him to go alone. They agreed that Daniel would walk with him to the quarry, but he would not cross the threshold. Karen made Ethan repeat Agnes's warnings until he could recite them without hesitation. The night before they left, Daniel opened a cedar chest in the attic and removed a small brass button from Walter's winter coat. The button was dark with age. Stamped into its face was a circle divided by one straight line, the same symbol drawn on Agnes's map. Daniel placed it in Ethan's palm and said that if anything from Walter's life could prove where the debt began, it was that. They left before sunrise on the last Saturday of September. Daniel carried a thermos of coffee and a flashlight. Ethan carried the map, the brass button, and a jacket zipped to his throat against the cold. The walk took almost 2 hours. They followed the damp grass along Miller's Creek, crossed 2 low ridges, and passed the leaning mill. Smoke curled from Agnes's stovepipe. She stood on the porch in a flannel coat, watching them. Ethan lifted the hand holding the map. Agnes gave one small nod. Neither she nor Daniel spoke. By the time the quarry walls rose ahead of them, the sun had cleared the trees, but the stones still held the night's cold. According to the map, the entrance lay behind a slab at the far eastern wall. Ethan and his father searched for 20 minutes before Daniel pulled away a curtain of dead ivy and uncovered the divided circle mark. Beneath it was a round indentation the size of the brass button. Ethan pressed Walter's button into the hollow. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the stone vibrated beneath his fingertips. The slab slid sideways with a low grinding sound and revealed a gap just wide enough for one person to pass through. There was no tunnel beyond it. There was only soft gray light, like the inside of an overcast sky. Daniel placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, the same way he had at the picnic 4 years earlier. This time he did not pull him away. He told Ethan to remember exactly who he was and where he came from. Agnes had said names and homes were difficult for graves to take unless a person offered them. Ethan said his full name. He said Karen's and Daniel's names. He said Millbrook, Ohio, and the rented house beyond Elm Street. Then he removed the brass button from the stone, closed it in his fist, and stepped sideways through the gap. The moment his second foot crossed the threshold, the gray light swallowed every sound from the quarry. He stood alone in a place that resembled the world he had left only in outline. A narrow creek moved through the vale without making a sound. Its surface remained smooth as glass even though a breeze pressed against Ethan's jacket. Bare trees with silver bark lined the banks, but none cast shadows. Not a single dark shape lay beneath the branches. It looked as if shadows had never been invented there. Ethan followed the silent creek because it was the only path that made sense. He counted his steps to keep his breathing steady. Near the 200th step, shapes appeared around a bend in the water. At first, he mistook them for people standing in fog. Then he saw that they floated inches above the frost-white ground. They were translucent, human-sized outlines with shoulders, arms, and heads, but no faces. Some stood straight. Some stooped. Some seemed to reach toward a person who was no longer there. Dozens became hundreds as the gray distance opened around him. Ethan understood that he was looking at stolen or surrendered shadows, each separated from the life it had once followed. Somewhere among them was the missing proof of his own place in the light. He stood at the edge of the drifting field until his fear stopped feeling like a command. Then he stepped between the pale forms. Each shadow gave off a faint impression as he passed: a woman's laugh in a kitchen, a child's terror beneath a bed, an old man's regret over a door he had never opened. The feelings brushed Ethan's mind and vanished. He kept his arms close to his sides and avoided touching anything. At last, he called Walter Marsh's name. The silver-bark trees rustled. Nothing else answered. He called again, adding his own name and the name of Millbrook. A voice settled into the air around him, low and unhurried. It told him he had walked a long way to be disappointed because names meant little in a place made from things people had abandoned. A tall figure emerged from behind the trees without seeming to cross the distance between them. He wore a long gray coat that matched the light and an old-fashioned hat pulled low over his face. There was no sun in the vale, yet darkness filled the space beneath the brim. Ethan knew at once that he was looking at the dusk man. The figure introduced himself as Graves. He spoke with perfect courtesy. He said he did not steal. He accepted what desperate people offered, whether the offering came directly from them or arrived later as an echo their family had never faced. Ethan asked why an agreement made by Walter could take a shadow from a baby who had never consented. Graves tilted his head. He said he had not taken Ethan's shadow in the ordinary sense. Walter had traded one winter of fear and hunger for one winter of peace. The silver was only the visible part of the bargain. Walter also surrendered the burden he could no longer bear, his guilt at failing his family and his terror of losing everything. Graves had taken that burden into the Vale. For a time, Walter's shadow became thin because part of the man was no longer attached to him. Years later, before Walter died, Graves returned the shadow itself. But Walter never confessed what he had done, never forgave himself, and never taught his children how to name the bargain. The unclaimed burden remained. Families, Graves said, were excellent at carrying what their elders refused to name. The echo passed through silence until it found Ethan, the first Marsh child born in Millbrook after Walter's death, during a storm that opened the old path. The echo did not follow Ethan like a shadow. It occupied the place where his shadow should have been, holding that space open until he came to claim it or replaced it with a bargain of his own. Ethan asked where the echo was. Graves lifted one gloved hand. A dark shape moved among the pale shadows near the creek, thinner than the others and trembling at the edges. It turned toward Ethan even though it had no face. A pressure formed behind his ribs, and he knew it belonged to him as surely as he knew his own name. Graves said returning it would require an exchange. The price, he explained, was never the same twice. It depended on what the person before him valued most. He offered to take the memory of the picnic, including Peggy's pointing finger and the word cursed. Ethan imagined losing that afternoon. For one dangerous second, relief washed through him. Graves continued. He could take all 4 years behind the curtains. Ethan would remember that time had passed, but not the loneliness, the whispers, or the look on his parents' faces. He could return to the sunlight without carrying any of the pain that had shaped him. The offer was so precise that Ethan almost answered before he remembered Agnes's warning. Fear was not permission. Relief was not freedom if someone else owned the missing pieces. He thought of Karen teaching him at the kitchen table, Daniel leaving his bedroom door open on the worst nights, and the quiet courage it had taken for all 3 of them to speak the truth at last. The painful years contained love as well as shame. Giving them away would not restore him. It would make another hollow place. Ethan opened his fist and showed Graves the brass button. He said it had belonged to Walter Marsh, son of Samuel Marsh, who had lived and died in Millbrook. Then he gave his own full name. He said he was the son of Daniel and Karen Marsh, and that his home was a small rented house beyond Elm Street where the kitchen window faced east. Graves' polite expression did not change, but the air grew colder. Ethan placed the button on the frost between them. He said he was returning the token of the old bargain, not offering a new one. He would not trade his memories, his name, his family, or anything else. Walter's fear was real, and the winter had been cruel, but Walter's choice did not belong to a child born generations later. Ethan refused to carry it in silence. He refused to renew it. He asked for the inherited debt to end with the truth. Graves went completely still. The drifting shadows around them stopped swaying. For the first time, his voice lost its polished calm. He said that in all his years of collecting, people had begged for lower prices, offered substitutes, lied about what they loved, and promised things that were not theirs to give. Very few had understood that an inherited bargain survived by becoming a new one. Fewer still had returned the first token, named the buried shame, and refused the exchange. Graves looked down at the brass button. Its surface had turned black. He admitted that he could hold the echo only while a Marsh treated it as an unpaid price. Ethan had named it for what it was, a burden passed forward without consent. That gave Graves no honest trade to complete. The dark shape by the creek loosened from the gray air. It unfolded as it approached, moving like smoke drawn toward an open window. Ethan's instinct told him to step back, but he held his ground. The shape reached his shoes and spread across the frost in the exact outline of his body. At the same moment, something settled inside his chest. It was not happiness. It was weight, warmth, and a quiet sense of being fully present. Graves watched him with an expression Ethan could not read. He said the veil would not open easily to marsh blood again. Any future debts in Ethan's life would have to be his own, earned and settled in the ordinary world of sunlight and consequence. Ethan thanked him. The words seemed to surprise Graves more than the refusal had. Then Ethan turned away. He walked past the silent creek and the countless shadows still waiting among the trees. He did not look back when Graves called his name once, softly, as if testing whether it still belonged to him. Ethan repeated the address of the house beyond Elm Street and kept walking. The opening in the quarry appeared ahead exactly where he had left it. Daniel sat on a flat rock beside the gap with the thermos between his hands. Ethan felt as though he had been gone for hours, but steam still rose from the cup. When he stepped through, morning sound returned all at once, wind across stone, a crow in the trees, Daniel drawing a sharp breath. Ethan's shadow stretched long and clear behind him in the low sun. Daniel crossed the distance in 3 strides and pulled his son into his arms without saying a word. The stone slab began to close. Before it sealed, Ethan glanced back. The brass button lay on the other side, black against the pale ground. A gray gloved hand reached down and covered it. Then the gap disappeared. They walked home as the sun climbed over Millbrook. At the old mill, Agnes Hollow stood on her porch. She looked at the shadow following Ethan, then at his face. She nodded once and went inside. Karen was waiting at the kitchen window. When she saw her son's shadow crossing the front steps, the sound she made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. She ran outside in her apron and held Ethan so tightly he could barely breathe. Daniel stood beside them, and for the first time the 3 marsh shadows fell together across the yard. Ethan did not return to school the next morning. Nothing changed that quickly. Karen met with the principal, Daniel spoke with a counselor, and Ethan began with half-days in early October. Some students whispered. Peggy Simmons stared at the pavement the first time he passed her, then looked away. Most of the other children lost interest once the impossible thing stopped happening in front of them. Ethan discovered that he did not need every whisper to end. He needed only to stop arranging his life around them. By the middle of autumn, he could stand in the schoolyard beneath the open sky without checking the ground every few seconds. His shadow stretched beside the others, ordinary in its shape and unmistakably his. On most days it moved exactly when he did. Only at dusk, when the light over Millbrook turned the same soft gray as the Hollow Vale, it sometimes seemed to lean toward the old quarry a heartbeat before Ethan turned for home.